Hey everyone, tonight we're talking about life expectancy. In the Middle Ages, a time when simply waking up in the morning could feel like a personal triumph. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting me know where you're joining from. It's always fascinating to see who's listening around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval history had a most misunderstood statistic award, it would go without competition to this sentence. People in the Middle Ages only lived to about 30. This line gets repeated so often, it's practically folklore. It's quoted confidently, dramatically, and almost always incorrectly, usually by someone who's never stopped to ask what an average actually means. Because that number doesn't mean medieval adults woke up on their 30th birthday, looked in the mirror, and said, "Ah, yes, the time has come," before gently collapsing into the nearest ditch. What it actually means is that childhood was an obstacle course designed by fate on a very bad day. Life expectancy is an average, not a countdown timer. And in the Middle Ages, that average was absolutely dragged down by infant and child mortality. When huge numbers of children died very young and they did, the math becomes deeply misleading. The average sinks, even if the adults who survived went on to live fairly long, stubborn lives. Imagine a village where half the children never reach adulthood. The survivors might live into their 50s or 60s, long enough to complain about their joints, criticize the youth, and insist things were better back in my day. But the average still looks grim because those early deaths pull the number down like an anchor tied to a sinking boat. This is why medieval life expectancy looks horrifying on paper. Birth itself was risky. Infancy was dangerous. Childhood was a long series of chances to get unlucky. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no germ theory, and no one saying, maybe don't drink that. A fever wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a negotiation. A small cut wasn't just an annoyance, it was a potential, career-ending injury for your entire life. The medieval world wasn't filled with weak adults. It was filled with adults who had already survived the hardest part, those who made it. Past childhood weren't fragile, they were battle-tested. So that famous number does tell us something important, just not what most people think. It tells us the Middle Ages weren't a world of universally short lives. They were a world where survival was front-loaded, uneven, and deeply unfair, which, frankly, is a very medieval way to do statistics. If medieval life expectancy was a numbers problem, birth was where the math immediately tried to kill you. Being born in the Middle Ages wasn't a gentle entrance into the world. It was a high-risk event, involving pain, uncertainty, and a complete lack of anyone who actually knew what they were doing. Childbirth was dangerous for everyone involved. Mothers faced labor without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and without the comforting presence of someone who understood infections. Midwives relied on experience, prayer, and a collection of herbal remedies that ranged from helpful to "this might make things worse, but we're committed now." There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no emergency surgery, no sterile instruments. If complications arose, the solution was often spiritual encouragement and hoping the situation respected good intentions. And the baby entered. A world that immediately tested its commitment to staying alive. Exposure to cold, poor nutrition, and disease began almost instantly. Even the first few days were critical. Many infants didn't survive long enough to be formally named, not because parents didn't care, but because naming someone who might not survive the week was emotionally expensive. Birth records from the Middle Ages reflect this harsh reality. Baptisms were sometimes rushed, not out of panic, but out of experience. People knew the odds. They lived with them. Mothers who survived childbirth weren't automatically safe either. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications could end lives. Days later, long after the baby had arrived, and everyone thought the danger had passed, survival required luck, layered on top of resilience. What makes this especially grim is repetition. Women didn't face this risk once. They faced it again and again. Multiple pregnancies were common. Each one was another roll of the dice, another conversation with fate that no one asked to have. And yet people kept having children, not because they were careless, but because survival depended on it. High mortality required high birth rates. Families adapted, even when adaptation meant living with constant uncertainty. Medieval people didn't assume birth meant life. They hoped for it carefully, quietly, and with the emotional restraint of people who'd learned that optimism needed limits. Birth in the Middle Ages wasn't the beginning of safety. It was the beginning of a long negotiation. If you survived birth in the Middle Ages, congratulations, you'd officially cleared the tutorial. Unfortunately, the real game started immediately afterward, and it was significantly harder. Childhood was not a protected, innocent phase of life. It was the most statistically dangerous period you would ever experience, and it showed absolutely no mercy. Medieval children faced dangers everywhere. Disease was constant. Hygiene existed, but without any understanding of why it mattered. Germs were invisible, mysterious, and apparently very committed to their work. A simple fever could spiral into something fatal, and no one knew when it crossed that line. Doctors didn't measure symptoms, they guessed confidently. Accidents were another favorite threat. Children worked early. They played near animals, tools, open fires, rivers, wells, and carts, with no safety standards whatsoever. Falling into something wasn't a rare mishap, was a common childhood milestone, and without modern medical care, injuries that seem minor today could quietly end a life. Nutrition didn't help. Many children lived on diets heavy in grains and light on variety. In good years, this was manageable. In bad years, it weakened bodies and lowered resistance to illness. Hunger made everything worse, including survival. Parents knew this. They watched children grow with a mixture of love and restraint. Every milestone was celebrated quietly, cautiously, as if joy itself might attract bad luck. The longer a child lived, the better their chances became, but no one ever fully relaxed. This is where modern misunderstandings begin. We imagine medieval childhood as emotionally cold. It wasn't. It was emotionally careful. Loving deeply while expecting loss was a survival strategy. People learned to hope in measured doses, and yet, despite everything, many children did survive. Those who made it past the most dangerous early years grew stronger, tougher, and remarkably resilient. By adolescence, survival odds improved significantly. At that point, you'd beaten the hardest level, without even realizing it. Childhood in the Middle Ages wasn't short because people didn't value children. It was short because the world did not care. If you reached adulthood, you didn't just grow up, you earned it. There's a stubborn myth that medieval parents didn't love their children because so many of them died. The logic usually goes like this: if loss was common, attachment must have been weak. This idea sounds neaty, emotionally tidy, and completely wrong. Medieval parents loved their children intensely. We know this from letters, wills, prayers, church records, and graves. Parents mourned deeply. They grieved publicly and privately. They wrote about their children. They paid for memorials when they could afford them. They didn't shrug, move on like emotionally distant robots, made of straw and theology. What medieval parents practiced wasn't emotional detachment, it was emotional management. When death is common, you don't stop loving, you stop assuming. You learn to love while holding back just enough to survive the grief if the worst happens. This wasn't coldness. It was experience. Parents celebrated milestones carefully. Child's first year mattered. Reaching early childhood mattered. Surviving winter mattered. Each stage unlocked a little more relief, a little more hope. Naming ceremonies were sometimes delayed not because parents were indifferent, but because naming someone who might not survive the month was emotionally expensive. It was grief budgeting. You can see this caution everywhere. Parents prayed obsessively. They used charms. They followed folk remedies. They tried everything available, even when those options ranged from mildly helpful to deeply questionable. This wasn't ignorance. It was desperation mixed with love. And when children died, parents didn't respond with stoicism. They responded with mourning that looks painfully familiar to us. Stares, prayers, guilt, anger, and silence appear repeatedly in medieval records. Loss hurt then just as much as it hurts now. The difference was frequency, not feeling. Ironically, this myth exists because medieval parents adapted so well. They functioned despite loss. They continued working, raising families, and living. Modern observers mistake resilience for indifference. But resilience isn't the absence of love. It's what love looks like when it has no choice but to continue. Medieval parents loved their children fully, just without the luxury of assuming a happy ending. Here's the plot twist most people never hear. If you survived childhood in the Middle Ages, your life expectancy quietly improved, dramatically, not magically. This was still the Middle Ages, but enough to completely reframe that infamous people only lived to 3. Once you made it past infancy, early childhood, and adolescence, you'd already cleared the most dangerous phase of medieval life. At that point, you were no longer constantly rolling the dice against nature. You were still playing the game, but the odds had stopped being openly hostile. Many medieval adults lived into their 50s. Quite a few reached their 60s. Some even reached their 70s, at which point the village collectively decided you were either blessed, cursed, or secretly immortal. Old age wasn't common, but it absolutely existed. And when it did, it came with authority. Elders were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything that went wrong, which is still how old age works today. This is where modern misunderstandings really collapse. Medieval society wasn't a place where everyone died young. It was a place where many died young, and the survivors often lived surprisingly long lives. Life expectancy statistics hide that distinction, flattening complex human experiences into a single misleading number. Once adulthood was reached, people settled into rhythms. They worked, married, raised families, complained about aches, and developed strong opinions about how lazy the younger generation had become. In other words, adulthood looked familiar, just with fewer safety nets and more medieval consequences. This doesn't mean life suddenly became safe. Disease, accidents, and hardship never fully disappeared. But survival stopped being a daily surprise. If you made it to adulthood, you'd proven yourself remarkably resilient even by medieval standards. It's also worth remembering that medieval people didn't expect to live forever. They didn't plan for retirement. They planned for continuity, passing knowledge, land, skills, and traditions to the next generation while they could. Surviving childhood didn't guarantee a long life, but it unlocked the possibility of one. And in a world where survival was never promised, that possibility meant everything. Surviving childhood in the Middle Ages didn't mean you'd beaten disease. It meant disease had agreed to stop sprinting at you and instead walk calmly behind you for the rest of your life. Illness wasn't an occasional visitor. It was background noise, always present, always waiting for an opening. Medieval people lived in close quarters with animals, waste, smoke, and each other. Towns smelled the way you'd expect when sanitation was more of a suggestion than a system. Clean water wasn't guaranteed. Food spoiled easily, and no one knew why any of this mattered, which is a crucial detail. Without germ theory, disease made no sense. Illness appeared random and deeply personal. One person survived a fever, another didn't. One family lost several members in a single season. Another emerged untouched and immediately became suspicious to everyone else. Plagues arrived suddenly and left chaos behind. Some were local, some regional, some rewrote history, even outside major outbreaks. Smaller illnesses chipped away constantly: respiratory infections, stomach illnesses, parasites, and skin infections were everyday realities. If you were alive, you were fighting something. Medical responses were enthusiastic but misguided. Doctors relied on ancient theories about bodily humors. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, sweating, and strongly worded optimism. Sometimes patients recovered despite the treatment. Sometimes they recovered because they stopped receiving it. Doctors called both outcomes success. What made disease especially dangerous was how quickly it escalated. A mild sickness could turn severe. In days, there was no concept of monitoring symptoms over time. If you worsened fast. Families often realized someone was in serious trouble only when it was already too late. Even strong adults were vulnerable. Hard work weakened bodies. Poor nutrition lowered resistance. Old winters and bad harvests created perfect conditions for illness to spread. Survival required luck layered on top of resilience, layered on top of exhaustion. And yet, people adapted. They learned patterns. They noticed seasons of sickness. They isolated when they could. They prayed, cleaned, rested, and hoped. Hope, it turns out, was a renewable resource. Disease didn't define medieval life, but it shaped every expectation. If you lived long, it wasn't because illness disappeared. It was because it missed you just enough. If disease was always lurking in the Middle Ages, medicine was always nearby, confidently doing its best. And by best, we mean operating on vibes, tradition, and an impressive amount of self-assurance. Medieval medicine wasn't useless, but it was deeply optimistic about how little evidence it needed. Doctors believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they thought, came from imbalance. The solution, naturally, was to remove something, usually blood, often a lot of it. If you were already weak, congratulations, you were about to become a teaching moment. Bloodletting was the medieval equivalent of turning something off and on again. Headache, bloodletting, fever, bloodletting, feeling sad. Probably bloodletting. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Doctors recorded both outcomes as proof the method was sound. Herbal remedies also played a role. Some were genuinely effective. Bark reduced pain, honey helped wounds, garlic had antimicrobial properties. Unfortunately, these useful treatments were mixed in with suggestions involving astrology, prayers, and substances that probably shouldn't have been ingested by anyone hoping to live longer. Surgery existed, but it was brave in the way standing in front of a charging bull is brave. No anesthesia, no antiseptics, no understanding of infection. Surgeons relied on speed, strength, and the patient's ability to scream loudly enough to remain conscious. Survival rates varied. Midwives and folk healers often had better practical knowledge than formally trained physicians. They learned through experience rather than ancient texts, but even they were limited by what the era understood, which wasn't much. The most dangerous part of medieval medicine was confidence. Doctors believed strongly in their methods. Patients trusted them because alternatives were limited to prayer or doing nothing. Sometimes doing nothing was actually the safer option, but this was difficult to explain when a man in robes was holding a knife and looking hopeful. And yet, medieval medicine did evolve. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Mistakes were repeated less often. Observations mattered even when explanations were wrong. Medicine didn't save most medieval lives, but it shaped how people understood illness, survival, and hope. In a world without guarantees, even guesswork felt better than silence. In the Middle Ages, what you ate didn't just affect your mood or waistline, it actively negotiated with your life expectancy. Diet was one of the most powerful forces shaping survival, and it worked quietly, slowly, and with absolutely no concern for fairness. For most peasants, food was repetitive and deeply beige. Bread formed the foundation of daily calories, usually dark, coarse, and packed with whatever grains happened to survive that year. Add some porridge, occasional vegetables, maybe a bit of cheese on. Congratulations, you were nutritionally sustained enough to keep working, but not enough to thrive. In good years, this diet worked. Bodies adapted. People survived. In bad years, everything unraveled. Failed harvests meant hunger. Hunger meant weakened immune systems. Weakened immune systems meant disease suddenly had an open invitation. Famine rarely killed alone. It arrived with friends. Meat existed, but not regularly for the poor. It appeared on special occasions, holidays, or when something had already died and needed to be dealt with quickly. Protein scarcity didn't immediately kill people, but it quietly shortened lives by making recovery harder. and illness more dangerous. Children were especially vulnerable. Growing bodies needed nutrients they didn't always get. Malnutrition slowed development, weakened bones, and left kids less able to fight infections. Many children survived, but survival came at a cost that showed up later in life. Meanwhile, the wealthy ate better, more variety, more protein, more calories, not necessarily healthier food by modern standards, but enough to give their bodies better odds. This didn't make nobles immortal. Disease still reached them, but it nudged the statistics in their favor. Seasonality mattered. Diets were worse. Fresh food disappeared. Preservation methods were limited. People ate what they had even when it wasn't ideal. Moldy bread, watered-down ale, and questionable leftovers were normal. Complaining didn't help. Starving faster didn't either. What makes medieval diet especially tragic is how invisible its effects were. No one collapsed dramatically from eating poorly. Instead, people grew weaker over time. They healed more slowly. They survived fewer illnesses. Their lives shortened it with a bang, but with a gradual loss of resilience. Diet didn't decide who lived or died on a single day. It decided who had a fighting chance when something went wrong. And in the Middle Ages, something was always going wrong. If disease and diet didn't end your life outright in the Middle Ages, work patiently waited its turn. Medieval labor wasn't something you did for 8 hours and then complained about online. It was constant, physical, repetitive, performed with the understanding that stopping wasn't an option unless you were actively dying on. Sometimes not even then. For peasants, work began early and ended late. Farming meant plowing, planting, harvesting, hauling, threshing, repairing tools, fixing fences, and doing it all again next year. There were no ergonomic tools, no safety standards, and no concept of lifting with your legs. Your back was expected to figure it out on its own. There were no ergonomic tools, no safety standards, and no concept of lifting with your legs. Your back was expected to figure it out on its own. Injuries were common and cumulative. A twisted ankle never fully healed. A damaged shoulder became permanent. A bad fall might not kill you immediately, but it would quietly reduce everything you could do afterward. And when your body failed, your ability to survive went with it. Work didn't usually kill people dramatically. It killed them slowly through exhaustion, vulnerability, and where a weakened body was less resistant to illness. A tired person healed poorly. An injured worker became dependent, and dependency was dangerous in a world without social safety nets. Children worked early, not because medieval parents were cruel, but because survival required it. By the time someone reached adulthood, their body had already logged decades of strain. This meant that even those who lived into older age often did so with chronic pain, reduced mobility, and a deep familiarity with suffering. Craftsmen and tradespeople fared slightly better. Their work was still hard, but less punishing than full-time agricultural labor. This difference shows up in records. Some professions lived longer on average, not because they were safer, but because they were less destructive over time. The irony is that hard work was valued culturally. Labor was moral. Idleness was suspicious. People took pride in endurance even when endurance shortened their lives. Complaining was allowed, but quitting wasn't. Work didn't usually end life on a single day. It reshaped bodies year by year until something else finished the job. And if you made it to old age, every ache was a record of survival, written directly into your bones. Medieval life expectancy was already unfair. But for women, the difficulty setting was quietly turned up without anyone asking for consent. Women faced nearly all the same dangers as men: disease, hunger, hard labor, and accident. Sand then added one more recurring threat that never took a day off: childbirth. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages wasn't treated as a medical condition. It was treated as an inevitable life event that everyone hoped would go well. There were no ultrasounds, no emergency interventions, and no clear understanding of why things went wrong when they did. Complications were common. Outcomes were unpredictable. Optimism was mandatory. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Labor could last days. Bleeding, infection, and trauma were constant risks. If something went wrong, help was limited to midwives doing their best with experience, prayers, and whatever tools they had. Sometimes that was enough. Often it wasn't. And the danger didn't end once the baby arrived. Post-birth infections quietly claimed lives days or weeks later. Women who seemed fine suddenly weren't. Families celebrated a successful birth only to find themselves planning a funeral shortly afterward. Medieval joy had a short memory window. What made this especially cruel was repetition. Women didn't face this risk once. They faced it repeatedly. Multiple pregnancies were common because survival depended on numbers. High child mortality required high birth rates. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice with the same body already weakened by labor, malnutrition, and work. Despite this, many women lived long lives. Records show women reaching older age, managing households, working fields, raising children, and becoming central figures in family and community life. Survival didn't mean ease. It meant endurance, layered on top of responsibility. Men often died from violence or labor-related strain. Women often died from biology, doing what biology does, with absolutely no concern for fairness. Life expectancy numbers reflect this if the stories behind them rarely get told. Being a woman in the Middle Ages didn't guarantee a shorter life, but it guaranteed more risk, and every year survived was not just luck. It was quiet resilience in a world that demanded it constantly, even when disease was quiet and food was available. Medieval life carried one more persistent background threat: violence. Not constant battlefield chaos, but the kind of everyday instability that hovered just close enough to matter. War, raids, feuds, and lawlessness didn't dominate every moment of life, but they were always within reach. Like a storm cloud, everyone pretended not to notice. Most medieval people weren't soldiers, but they lived in a world where conflicts flared often and resolved slowly. Armies moved through the countryside, not around it. When they did, peasants paid the price. Crops were trampled, livestock disappeared, villages were looted strategically. Survival during wartime had less to do with bravery and more to do with not being noticed. Young men faced the highest risk. They were the ones conscripted, pressed into service, or caught in fighting, whether they wanted to be or not. This skewed life expectancy even further. Entire age groups could be thinned out by a single campaign, leaving behind gaps that statistics quietly absorbed. Violence also existed. Disputes over land, inheritance, or honor could turn deadly. Law enforcement was inconsistent. Justice depended heavily on who you were, where you lived, and whether someone important cared enough to intervene. For many, avoiding conflict was a survival skill on par with farming. Accidents, interpersonal violence, and daily hazards blended easily. Taverns, tools, animals, and weapons lived in close proximity. A bad argument, combined with alcohol and sharp objects, could end a life quickly. These deaths weren't constant, but they were common enough to matter. What made violence especially dangerous was how it stacked with everything else. Hunger weakened bodies, disease reduced recovery. An injury that might be survivable today could be fatal. Then a wound wasn't just trauma. It was an invitation for infection to finish the job. And yet, medieval life wasn't a non-stop bloodbath. Most people lived ordinary lives most of the time. They worked, celebrated, argued, reconciled, and endured. Violence shaped expectations, daily routines. Life expectancies suffered, not because violence was everywhere, but because when it appeared, it was unforgiving. In the Middle Ages, peace was never permanent. It was something you enjoyed carefully while it lasted. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy didn't just depend on luck, resilience, or avoiding suspicious fevers. It also depended heavily on something you had absolutely no control over: who you were born to. Social class quietly tilted the odds long before anyone had a chance to make good decisions. Peasants lived closer to danger. Hard labor, poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and crowded living conditions all worked together to shorten lives. If you were poor, your body absorbed the cost of survival every single day. You didn't get breaks. You didn't get lighter duties when injured. You worked until you couldn't stand, then you worked some more. Nobles lived differently. They ate better. They slept in warmer homes. They worked less physically demanding jobs. They had servants to absorb risk on their behalf. This mattered not because nobles were smarter or stronger, but because their bodies weren't constantly being worn down by survival itself. This doesn't mean nobles were safe. Far from it. Disease didn't respect titles. Plagues happily swept through castles. Poor medical knowledge affected everyone equally. And nobles had a habit of dying in wars, tournaments, and ambitious political schemes. Privilege improved, odds not. Outcomes: the clergy often lived longer than both peasants and nobles. Their lives involved less physical labor, more stable food access, and communal support. Monasteries functioned as early social safety nets. Regular meals, shelter, and care during illness made a measurable difference. It turns out rest and routine are good for survival. Urban life sat somewhere in between. Cities offered opportunity and danger in equal measure. Better access to food and trade competed with overcrowding, waste, and disease. Living in a city could extend your life, guarantee survival. It nudged probabilities. A peasant could live long. A noble could die young. But statistically, comfort mattered. Reduced physical strain mattered. Consistent nutrition mattered. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages wasn't evenly shared. It was distributed according to burden. And the heaviest burdens were carried by those least able to avoid them. One of the strangest modern misconceptions about the Middle Ages is the idea that old people simply didn't exist, as if medieval Villages were populated entirely by the young, the exhausted, and the recently deceased. In reality, old age absolutely existed. It just didn't distribute itself evenly or politely. If you walked through a medieval village, you'd often find eldersmen and women with bent backs, weathered faces, and joints that complained louder than the church bells. These people had survived disease, hunger, war, childbirth, and decades of physical labor. They weren't anomalies, they were survivors. What made old age rare wasn't biology, was access. Access to food, access to stability, access to a body that hadn't been completely destroyed by work or repeated illness. Those who reached old age often did so because they'd either been unusually lucky or lived lives that allowed their bodies to endure. Old age came with status. Elders were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything from bad harvests to improper youth behavior. They were living memory. They remembered past famines, past wars, and past mistakes, which meant they were either valued for wisdom or ignored for being inconveniently correct. That said, old age wasn't gentle. There was no retirement, no pensions, no medical support designed to keep you comfortable. Aging meant pain. It meant reduced mobility. It meant dependence on family and community. If that support failed, survival became uncertain very quickly. Interestingly, medieval people didn't view old age the way we do. It wasn't something everyone expected to reach. It was seen as a bonus stage, a blessing, sometimes even a burden. Living long meant you'd outlasted many of your peers, which brought both honor and loneliness. Records show people living into their 60s and 70s, sometimes even beyond. These individuals didn't invalidate low life expectancy numbers. They explained them. They showed what was possible when early risks were survived. Old age in the Middle Ages wasn't rare because people couldn't live long. It was rare because too many never got the chance. And those who did, they carried an entire era on their backs, literally and historically, by this point. It should be clear that medieval life expectancy has been doing a very poor job of explaining medieval lives. The number exists. It is technically accurate, and it is almost always misunderstood in the most confident way possible. Life expectancy isn't a promise. It's not a prediction. It's not a countdown clock hovering over your head. It's an average mathematical summary of wildly uneven experiences. And in the Middle Ages, those experiences were uneven to the point of absurdity. When half of all children die young, averages collapse. They get dragged downward by tragedy, long before adulthood even has a chance to participate. The result is a number that sounds shocking but explains very little, unless you understand what shaped it. Modern readers often hear low life expectancy and imagine a society where everyone lived short, miserable lives. That image feels neat and dramatic. It is also wrong. Medieval people didn't move through life expecting to die at a certain age. They expected uncertainty. They expected risk. They expected that survival was something you earned year by year, not something guaranteed by default. This difference matters. People planned their lives differently. They didn't think in decades ahead. They thought in seasons, harvests. Winters survived children grown strong enough to help. Each year lived was an accomplishment, not a stepping stone toward a fixed endpoint. Life spanned the maximum age someone can reach. Surprisingly, stable across human history. What changed dramatically was how many people reached it. Medieval society filtered people early and harshly. Modern society filters far later. The ceiling didn't move much, the floor did. Statistics hide that human truth. They compress grief, luck, endurance, and resilience into a single number and pretend it tells the whole story. It doesn't. It never has. Life expectancy tells us how dangerous a society is, not how fragile its people are. Medieval people weren't biologically weaker. They were environmentally overwhelmed. Understanding this changes how we see the Middle Ages, not as a world of short lives, but as a world of high risk, where survival itself was an achievement worth respecting. When you step back and look at medieval life expectancy without the misleading averages, a quieter truth begins to emerge. Medieval people weren't constantly dropping dead at a fixed age, and they weren't unaware of how dangerous their world was. They lived with that knowledge. Every day, survival wasn't assumed. It was negotiated. Life in the Middle Ages was shaped less by a number and more by exposure. Exposure to disease, hunger, violence, childbirth, accidents, and exhaustion. Each of these risks shaved lives away unevenly, early, and often. Some people were taken quickly. Others endured long enough to become the quiet pillars of their communities. The difference was rarely moral, intelligent, or deserved. It was circumstantial. Medieval people didn't expect long lives. They hoped for functional ones. A good year meant enough food, no serious illness, and everyone still breathing by winter's end. That was success. Planning decades into the future made little sense when next season was never guaranteed. And yet, people still loved deeply. They raised families, they passed on skills, they told stories, they complained about the weather, they argued with neighbors, they celebrated weddings and mourned losses with a familiarity that feels painfully modern. Shorter odds didn't make life meaningless. If anything, they made it more immediate. The cruelty of medieval life expectancy isn't that people died young, it's that death arrived unpredictably. Some lives were brief and unfair, others were long and heavy with experience. The averages flattened those stories into something tidy and misleading. When someone did reach old age, it mattered. Elders were living proof that endurance was possible. They carried memory, perspective, and sometimes wisdom forged through loss. Their presence reminded everyone else that survival wasn't impossible, just uncertain. It was fragile, and in that fragility, people adapted. They worked, endured, and continued forward anyway, not because they misunderstood danger, but because living has always been an act of defiance against it. Life expectancy tells us how harsh a world is. It doesn't tell us how human the people living in it were. And medieval people were profoundly, stubbornly human right to the end. Authority depended on balance. Too much ambition invited suspicion. Too much silence invited erasure. Nefertari walked this narrow path with precision. She never challenged the king's supremacy, yet she expanded the meaning of queenship so thoroughly that it could never return to something lesser. After her, the idea of the queen as merely ornamental no longer held. What makes her legacy endure is not a single achievement, but coherence. Her public image, religious role, diplomatic voice, and funerary preparation all tell the same story. There is no contradiction between who she was in life and how she was represented in death. That unity is rare in any era, ancient or modern. It suggests intentional self-definition, a woman who knew exactly how she wished to be remembered and ensured that memory was secured in stone. Nefertari also benefited from timing. She lived during the height of imperial confidence, when Egypt had the resources to elevate individuals into near-mythic status. But others shared that era, and few left such a clear imprint. The difference lies in agency. Nefertari did not wait to be interpreted. She presented herself. Her story reminds us that power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it writes letters instead of laws. Sometimes it appears in ritual rather than battle. Sometimes it survives not through conquest but through continuity. Nefertari mastered these quieter forms of influencing. In doing so, outlasted many whose names were carved deeper but meant less. Today she occupies a unique space between history and reverence. She is studied, admired, and still partially unknowable. That mystery is not a flaw in her legacy. It is part of its strength. Ancient Egyptians believed that the dead should retain some distance from the living, a sacred boundary that preserved their power. Nefertari remains just far enough away to command respect. In the end, she was more than the wife of a great king, more than the owner of a beautiful tomb. She was a model of how intelligence, restraint, and symbolism could shape an empire's memory. And that, perhaps, is her greatest achievement. High in the Ali Mountains, where winters harden the ground into stone and silence dominates the landscape, a group of archaeologists opened an ancient burial mound, expecting little more than broken tools and scattered bones. Instead, they uncovered something profoundly unsettling. A woman preserved by ice so perfectly that time itself seemed to have failed. She lay in a wooden chamber sealed by permafrost. Her body was wrapped carefully, surrounded by objects placed with intention. The cold had done what embalming could not. It halted decay completely. Her skin remained intact. Her hair still clung to her scalp. Even the delicate textures of her clothing survived. This was not a skeleton reduced to fragments. This was a person, recognizable, human, and eerily present. When the ice was removed, the shock only deepened. Dark, intricate tattoos stretched across her skin, curling into animal shapes and flowing lines. These were not decorative scratches or faded marks. They were deliberate, complex designs placed with skill and meaning. The patterns suggested identity, belief, and status. Whoever she was, she mattered. The burial itself was extraordinary. She had been laid to rest with care, not haste. Her position, the objects around her, and the effort required to construct such a chamber in hostile terrain all pointed to importance. This was not the grave of an ordinary nomad. This was someone worth protecting from time, from animals, from forgetting. What made the discovery so haunting was not just preservation, but immediacy. Archaeologists often deal with distance, centuries reduced to artifacts. Here, that distance collapsed. The Ice Maiden confronted the modern world face to face. Her body still carried the shape of life. Her expression was calm, composed, almost deliberate. Death had not erased her presence. News of the discovery spread quickly, not because of gold or weapons, but because of her humanity. She forced a question that archaeology rarely answers so clearly. Who was she? A priestess, a leader, a healer, a warrior. The ice preserved her form, but not her story. Yet even in silence, the message was clear. This woman had lived with significance in a world long erased from written memory. The frozen earth had guarded her for more than 2 millennia. Now she was asking to be understood, to understand the Ice Maiden. One must understand the world that shaped her, the vast mobile society of the Scythians. They were not city builders, temple raisers, or chronics. To understand the Ice Maiden, one must understand the world that shaped her, the vast mobile society of the Scythians. They were not city builders, temple raisers, or chroniclers of their own history. They left no written records to explain themselves. Instead, they lived on horseback, carried their wealth with them, and trusted memory, ritual, and movement over stone and permanence. The Scythian world stretched across immense grasslands and mountains, corridors of place defined by wind, cold, and distance. Survival here required adaptability and toughness. Communities followed seasonal routes, herding animals, trading with distant cultures, and defending themselves constantly. This was not a passive existence. It was a life shaped by motion and readiness. Within this nomadic structure, women were not confined to domestic silence. Archaeology has revealed that Scythian women rode horses, hunted, and in some cases fought. Burials show women interred with weapons, tools, and symbols of authority. The idea that power belonged only to men does not hold in this landscape. In a world where everyone depended on skill and endurance, status followed ability. Religion and belief played a central role. The Scythians viewed the natural world as alive, with forces that required respect and negotiation. Mountains, animals, and the sky itself held meaning. Ritual specialists, shamans, healers, or spiritual mediators guided communities through illness, death, and transition. Tattoos, clothing, and burial practices were not decoration, they were language. This context matters deeply when viewing the Ice Maiden. Her elaborate tattoos, careful burial, and isolation from common graves suggest a role that went beyond ordinary life. In Scythian society, to invest such effort in death meant the person carried power in life, spiritual, social, or both. The Scythians also existed at a crossroads. They traded with distant civilizations, absorbing influences while retaining their identity. Persian goods, Chinese silks, and local traditions blended into something uniquely theirs. This mixture created a culture both fierce and refined, capable of artistry alongside violence. The Ice Maiden emerged from this world not as an anomaly, but as a product of it. She belonged to a society that valued strength, symbolism, and resilience. To them, preserving her body was not about mourning alone. It was about continuity, ensuring that her presence, whatever it represented, would endure beyond death. Among all the details revealed by the ice, nothing was more striking than the tattoos etched into the Ice Maiden's skin. They were not random markings or simple symbols. They were elaborate, flowing images of animals, deer with twisted antlers, mythical beasts in motion, predators locked in eternal pursuit. Even after more than 2 millennia, the ink remained dark and deliberate, as if freshly drawn. In the Scythian world, tattoos were not fashion, they were identity. These images functioned as biography written on the body itself. Each figure carried layers of meaning tied to ancestry, belief, and role. Within the community, animals were not chosen casually. They represented spiritual forces, protective spirits, and personal power. To wear them permanently was to declare alignment with those forces. The placement of the tattoos matters as much as their content. They ran along her arms, shoulders, and hands, visible places meant to be seen during daily life and ritual. This suggests her body was not hidden or restricted, but displayed intentionally. She was someone whose presence carried meaning in public space. The tattoos transformed her flesh into a living symbol. What makes this even more compelling is the level of skill involved. Tattooing in the ancient steppe was painful, dangerous, and irreversible. Infection was a real risk. Enduring such work required stamina and purpose. No one would submit to it lightly. This alone suggests status. These were not marks imposed by others. They were earned. Scholars believe that tattoos may also have served a ritual function beyond life. In Scythian belief, the soul continued after death, and identity needed to be preserved. The tattoos ensured that the Ice Maiden would be recognized in the spirit world, just as she had been among the living. Her body became a passport between realms. There is also evidence that tattoos distinguished spiritual specialists from the rest of society. Shamans and healers often bore complex markings that reflected their ability to move between worlds, the visible and the unseen. The Ice Maiden's tattoos are unusually intricate, more refined than those found on many warriors. This points toward a role rooted in knowledge rather than combat. In a culture without written records, the body itself became text. The Ice Maiden carried her story in ink and skin, readable to those who understood the language. Even now, long after that language has faded, the message remains unmistakable. This was a woman whose identity was sacred, deliberate, and meant to endure. Her tattoos did what words could not. They survived. The Ice Maiden was not buried in ordinary clothing. Her garments were layered, deliberate, and astonishingly well preserved, offering a rare window into how identity was worn in a nomadic world. Textiles usually vanish first in archaeology, but here the permafrost acted like a vault. Wool, felt, leather, and fur survived long enough to tell a story as clearly as her tattoos. Her clothing was practical, but not plain. It was designed for movement, cold, and long journey. See it crafted with care and visual balance. The cuts allowed for riding and walking across uneven terrain. The materials were durable, chosen for survival in harsh climates, but survival alone does not explain the precision. These garments were not thrown together. They were made to communicate. Color mattered. Texture mattered. The layering itself mattered. In steppe cultures, clothing functioned as social language. What you wore signaled who you were, where you belonged, and how you were meant to be treated. The Ice Maiden's attire suggests elevated status, not royal, in a settled sense, but respected, perhaps even revered. Some elements of her clothing show connections to the broader cultural sphere associated with the Pazyryk culture, known for its refined craftsmanship despite a nomadic lifestyle. This culture valued symmetry, animal symbolism, and skilled textile work. Clothing was not decoration alone. It was protection, identity, and ritual combined. Footwear found near her body was especially telling. Well-made boots indicate frequent travel possibly long distances, on horseback. This was not someone confined to a single camp or domestic space. She moved, she participated. She belonged to the active rhythm of nomadic life. Her headdress, though damaged, suggests ceremonial use. Headgear in steppe societies often marked spiritual roles or special occasions. Combined with her tattoos, this hints again at a woman whose function extended beyond the everyday. Clothing reinforced what ink declared. Even in burial, her garments remained intact, carefully arranged. This was not accidental. Dressing the dead was an act of belief. The Scythians prepared their dead for continuation, not disappearance. The Ice Maiden was dressed to exist beyond death as she had in life, competent, recognized, and whole. In a culture without palaces or permanent monuments, clothing became the architecture of the self. The Ice Maiden's garments were her walls, her banners, her status symbols. Thanks to the ice, they survived, and through them, so did her place in the world. The Ice Maiden's burial makes one thing clear: her authority did not come from comfort or luxury. It came from endurance. Life on the Siberian steppe was unforgiving, shaped by extreme cold, constant movement, and the demands of animals and terrain. Power in this world was not inherited easily. It was proven daily. Evidence from her remains suggests a life marked by strain and resilience. Her body shows signs of wear consistent with riding, travel, and physical labor. This was not someone sheltered from hardship. Whatever role she held, healer, ritual specialist, or leader, it required active participation in the life of her people. Respect here was earned through usefulness. Nomadic societies valued individuals who could contribute beyond the ordinary. A woman who understood herbs, illness, and ritual would have been indispensable. Illness, injury, and spiritual anxiety were constant threats. Someone who could ease pain, interpret signs, or mediate with unseen forces held real power. Such power did not rely on force, but on trust. This helps explain why the Ice Maiden was buried alone, separate from common graves. Isolation in burial was not loneliness. It was distinction. Certain individuals were set apart in death because they were set apart in life. The effort required to prepare her tomb, transport materials, and seal it in ice suggests collective agreement that she mattered deeply. Importantly, this power was not theatrical. There are no weapons beside her, no trophies of conquest. Her authority was quieter, embedded in knowledge and belief. In many steppe cultures, spiritual figures were both respected and feared. They healed, but they also commanded boundaries. Their closeness to the unseen made them necessary and dangerous. To offend her age at death also matters. She was not elderly nor a child. She died in adulthood, likely while still active in her role. This raises questions. Was her death sudden? Was it connected to illness, ritual, or fate? The care taken in burial suggests reverence rather than urgency. Whatever happened, it was not dismissive. The Ice Maiden's power, then, was situational and human. She lived among her people, traveled with them, endured what they endured. That shared experience gave her legitimacy. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, such legitimacy was stronger. Her life reminds us that leadership does not always sit on thrones. Sometimes it rides through snow, carries knowledge instead of weapons, and leaves its mark not in stone, but in memory and in ice. The way the Ice Maiden was buried tells us as much about her death as her life. This was not a hurried interment driven by fear or crisis. It was deliberate, ceremonial, and costly in effort. The Scythians did not stumble into preserving her, they chose it. Her burial chamber was carved into the earth and sealed in a way that allowed water to seep in and freeze. This was not accidental. In the Ally region, certain burials were intentionally designed to harness ice as protection. The community understood the land intimately. They knew that frozen ground could become a guardian stronger than stone. By sealing her within it, they placed her beyond animals, weather, and time. This suggests that her body mattered beyond mourning. In many nomadic belief systems, the physical body retained spiritual significance after death. Preserving it was a way of preserving balance. If she was a ritual specialist or healer, her body may have been seen as dangerous to disturb or powerful enough to require containment. Ice, neutral and eternal, was the safest boundary. The grave goods reinforce this idea. Objects placed with her were not excessive, but meaningful. They reflect function rather than wealth. This was not a display of status meant to impress rivals. It was preparation. She was being equipped, not celebrated. That distinction matters. There is also the question of cause. Her body shows signs of illness, possibly cancer and injuries, consistent with long-term strain. This was not a peaceful death of old age, but it was not treated as a failure either. Illness did not diminish her worth. If anything, it may have heightened her spiritual authority. In many ancient cultures, suffering was seen as proximity to the unseen. The separation of her burial from others suggests caution as much as honor. Powerful figures were often buried apart to prevent their influence from lingering too strongly among the living. This was not exile, it was respect mixed with fear. The ice did more than preserve flesh, it preserved intent. Every choice made by her community remains legible because nothing decayed. Their care, their beliefs, their priorities are frozen alongside her. Death did not erase the Ice Maiden, it transformed her role. She moved from guide of the living to presence in the landscape itself. The mountain became her marker. The cold became her shield. She was not lost to the earth. She was entrusted to it. When the Ice Maiden emerged from the frozen ground in the modern era, the shock was not limited to archaeology. Her rediscovery disrupted assumptions, scientific, cultural, and emotional about the ancient nomadic world. This was not a distant relic reduced to fragments. This was a woman whose face, skin, and markings confronted the present almost directly. The past was no longer abstract, it was personal. For researchers, the find was unprecedented. Permafrost preservation revealed details normally erased forever. Clothing construction, tattoo techniques, health conditions, and burial intent. Entire academic debates shifted overnight. The idea that nomadic cultures were crude or lacking refinement became impossible to defend. Here was proof of medical knowledge, artistic sophistication, and complex spiritual systems, all embodied in a single individual. But the reaction did not stop at science. Among the local descendants of steppe cultures, the Ice Maiden's removal sparked controversy and grief. To them, she was not an object of study. She was an ancestor. Her disturbance was seen by some as a violation, a rupture of balance that had been carefully maintained for centuries. Illness, accidents, and misfortune were later blamed on her displacement. Whether coincidence or belief, the emotional response was real. This clash revealed a deeper tension between modern knowledge and ancient reverence. Archaeology seeks answers by uncovering indigenous memory, seeks continuity by leaving things undisturbed. The Ice Maiden stood at the center of this conflict, silent, preserved, and powerless to intervene in her second disruption. Museums displayed her remains behind glass, temperature-controlled and labeled. Visitors stared in awe, discomfort, fascination. She became famous without consent, from sacred individual to global spectacle. Yet even in this setting, she resisted objectification. Her tattoos demanded interpretation. Her posture suggested intention. Her presence unsettled the idea that time creates distance. Eventually, pressure from local communities led to a partial resolution. Efforts were made to rebury her remains closer to her original resting place, restoring some measure of respect. The debate did not disappear, but it changed. She was no longer just a discovery. She became a reminder that the past is not neutral territory. The Ice Maiden's rediscovery forced a question archaeology rarely confronts directly. Who owns the dead? The scientists who uncover them, or the descendants who remember them? There is no simple answer. Once again, the Ice Maiden altered the world around her, not through action, but through presence. Even after 2,000 years of silence, she still had the power to disturb, to challenge, and to demand respect. The Ice Maiden did more than reveal a single life frozen in time. She forced historians to reconsider an entire world that had long been misunderstood for centuries. Nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppe were portrayed as peripheral, violent, primitive, and intellectually dependent on settled civilizations. The Ice Maiden quietly dismantled that narrative. Her body provided evidence of advanced medical awareness, artistic complexity, and symbolic thought. The tattoos alone required anatomical knowledge, steady technique, and long-term planning. Her clothing revealed mastery of textile production, adapted to extreme environments. Her burial showed deliberate engagement with landscape, climate, and belief. None of this fits the stereotype of a crude or simplistic society. Most importantly, she changed how historians viewed women in these cultures. Before her discovery, powerful women among the steppe peoples were often dismissed as exceptions or myth. The Ice Maiden proved otherwise. She demonstrated that authority, spiritual influence, and public presence were not restricted by gender in nomadic societies. Power followed function, not formality. She also blurred the line between spiritual and political leadership. In settled civilizations, those roles were often separated. Among the steppe cultures, they overlapped. A woman who understood ritual, healing, and symbolism could wield influence equal to any warrior. The Ice Maiden embodied this integration. Her life suggests leadership rooted in knowledge rather than domination. Her preservation reshaped methodology as well. Archaeologists were forced to confront how much context is lost when organic material decays. Entire aspects of ancient life, color, texture, expression usually vanish. The Ice Maiden reminded scholars that what survives is often only a fraction of what once existed. History, it turns out, is incomplete not because people lacked complexity, but because evidence rarely endures. She also influenced public imagination. Unlike kings and generals, she was relatable. Her humanity was visible. Visitors did not see a conqueror. They saw a person. This emotional connection altered how audiences engaged with ancient history, making it less about abstraction and more about lived experience. In this sense, the Ice Maiden became a bridge. She connected modern observers to a vanished world, not through texts or monuments, but through presence. She made the past intimate. Her impact continues to ripple outward. Every new study of nomadic cultures now carries her shadow. Every claim of simplicity must confront her evidence. She did not speak yet. She corrected centuries of misunderstanding. History did not change because of what she said. It changed because of what she proved simply by surviving. In the end, the Ice Maiden's greatest power lies in her refusal to disappear. Civilizations rise and fall. Languages die. Entire ways of life dissolve into silence. Yet she endured not as legend or myth, but as reality. Her survival was not symbolic. It was physical, and that makes her impossible to ignore. She represents a kind of historical honesty that written sources rarely offer. There is no court poet exaggerating her deeds, no chronicler reshaping her story to serve politics. What we see is what remained: her body, her markings, her choices, and the care her people gave her. These are truths carved not into stone, but into flesh and ice. The Ice Maiden also challenges how we define importance. She was not an empress. She commanded no armies. Her name, if it ever had one, known beyond her people, is lost. Yet her influence today rivals that of famous rulers. Why? Because she embodies lived authority, the kind that emerges from knowledge, resilience, and trust rather than hierarchy. She forces modern audiences to confront an uncomfortable idea that history has often remembered the loudest, not the most essential. Countless lives like hers vanished without trace simply because their worlds did not write. The Ice Maiden survived by chance. Yes, but also because her people believed she mattered enough to protect forever. There is something profoundly human in that decision. They did not know she would be discovered. They did not preserve her for fame. They preserved her because they believed she should remain whole. That belief crossed centuries intact today. When people stand before her image or read about her life, the reaction is rarely academic alone. It is emotional. She looks back at us. She reminds us that ancient people were not abstract ancestors, but individuals with bodies, identities, fears, and